Welcome to my panel on Green Public Procurement. My name is Désirée Klingler and I'm a PhD student at the University of St. Gallen, funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation. Before I jump into the panel and interviews with the four speakers, I would like to give you a brief overview over my own research. I am investigating the economic consequences of public procurement law. And most importantly, I'm interested in efficient and optimal public procurement procedures, both from an efficiency perspective, but also from a sustainability and quality perspective. I'm also looking into how to measure quality and sustainability requirement in public procurement, and look as a third point into how politics plays into this equation. So my approach is very much an interdisciplinary approach between law and economics. And I'm very thrilled, for that matter, today to have people from different backgrounds in the panel today. So from both economic, legal, judicial, and both with a European and an American background. So my first speaker will be Marta Andhov. She is professor at the University of Copenhagen, and she has recently published a book on life cycle costing. Life cycle costing is an important criterion in achieving green public procurement, and we will hear about her opinion how to best implement and achieve this very ambitious goal. My second speaker is Marc Steiner. He's judge at the Swiss Federal Administrative Court and is writing judgments on public procurement. He will talk about the new Swiss law that has been adopted on January 1st, 2021, so this year, and how sustainability can be achieved or can be treated also from a judicial role. The third speaker is Carine Staropoli. She is professor at the Paris School of Economics, and she is looking at green public procurement from an economic, empirical angle. Among other things, she is working on two papers that she will talk about, which address both which would be the best procurement method to achieve green public procurement, and also how politics plays into the whole question. So very close to my own research. And lastly, we will have Stephen Schooner. He is professor of law at the George Washington University and an expert in public procurement, well known in the United States. He will be talking about Biden's new approach or proclamation to introduce electric vehicles for the government, which very much forms part of green public procurement, and how sustainable acquisition policy is achieved or not achieved, and what the outlook is on green public procurement. On that note, I would like to start with the interviews and wish you a lot of fun with the coming speakers. Thank you. Thank you very much, Marta Andhov, for being here today with me. Marta Andhov is a professor at Copenhagen University, and she is an expert and specialist in green public procurement or sustainable procurement with a focus on EU public procurement law. Today we will talk about the concept called life cycle costing, and I will ask her three questions about this specific concept. Starting with the first one. What is the concept of life cycle costing, LLC, in the context of EU public procurement law? And a follow-up question, does it form part of economic or environmental sustainability?
Thank you, Désirée, for having me. And to answer your question, I would point out that from a regulatory perspective, it's a new concept that has been introduced for the first time in the newest set of public procurement directives. But that is not to be said that it was anyhow prohibited previously. But for the first time, we definitely have this concept that ultimately means that We are not to focus solely on the price, and by price I mean the acquisition price of the goods or services of works that we purchase, but we are to look broader, that we are to look from a perspective of costing in a holistic manner, that we look on a whole lifetime of the project. So in other words, when we talk about life cycle, it means all consecutive and interlinked stages that can start with aspects such as research and development and be carried out all the way through production, training, transport, use, maintenance, but also ultimately to the end of the life cycle, meaning the disposal, clearance, utilization of goods and services. So through that lens, we look at life cycle costing in public procurement. When we use life cycle costing, well, when we talk about award criteria for the contract that we're procuring, and at that time, when we're deciding on what basis we're going to choose the winner of our bid, of our procurement process, life cycle costing can be one of the methods on how we evaluate the price. You ask also in the follow-up question whether this economic or environmental aspect. I would say that it's both, because we ultimately talk under the theme of life cycle costing that is regulated in Article 68 of the directive about a whole different variety cost, and some of them very clearly sound like an economic part of the assessment, such as cost relating to maintenance, cost relating to acquisition, cost of consumption of energy and other resources. But at the same time, we also, within the concept of life cycle costing, look to other costs, which we refer to as environmental costs, external environmental cost also. And those very clearly relate to the environmental assessment. So I would say both, depending how we approach it. And I would say that the concept of life cycle costing is also scalable. So it can be quite basic. Then we, of course, come to a discussion whether we're discussing a truly life cycle costing methodology, or rather the concepts such as total cost of ownership. On the most advanced scale of that, we definitely consider the greenhouse gas emissions of our contract and other pollutant emissions and climate mitigation cost within the assessment of the proposal.
Great, thank you so much, Marta. Actually, if I may, I would like to ask you to add on questions, because I think it's very interesting to go a little bit more into detail on what you said. Like the first one would be just to set a little bit the scene for people who have not been involved with life cycle costing so far. How is it different from the law that we had before when we introduced life cycle costing?
Sure. So that's a very good point that you're making. So I think that why life cycle costing is so interesting and at the same time perceived in practice is quite problematic is if we look on some of the statistical data, and bear in mind that I would like to highlight that the issue of that data within public procurement in Europe in general is quite problematic. But if we look at the data that some of the studies put forward, is that we still look at more than 70% of public procurement Europe-wide, the award criteria that is being used predominantly is the lowest price. Now, the problem with the lowest price, it's not even the lowest cost, but it's just acquisition price. And that is very clear on example of light bulbs. This is a very traditional example that we tend to use, right? So if you're buying the cheapest light bulbs on the market, your acquisition price at the moment of purchasing them is the lowest. It seems like a great deal, but what you don't take into account is ultimately how much you pay for energy consumption using those cheapest light bulbs, how long longevity of that product is, and what you're going to do when you're going to be disposing them. If you compare it to, for example, buying the more advanced LED light bulbs, well, they have acquisition price that is higher. So technically you're paying more at the moment of acquisition, but you're going to pay much less in context of energy consumption throughout the lifespan of your contract. And you will most presumably also need less maintenance and exchange of those light bulbs because they have much longer longevity. So that ultimately, after, let's say, if that is a contract, let's say for 4 years, and if you do the accounting of your costs, the lifespan on those projects, depending if you bought the cheap light bulb or the little bit more expensive one, but the more also, let's say, environmentally friendly one, the whole cost of the project will be actually lower in case when you put more money at the beginning. So in other words, if we would solely consider the acquisition price, those light bulbs that in the end become a better deal would not be really the ones that would be purchased. So this is what we, in other words, not fighting for, but this is what we're promoting, right? For you to actually take a step further and consider more holistically your project and how you evaluate your project and what methods of costs you look into.
Thank you so much. I think this makes, in my perspective, a lot of sense because the state takes a role model function, I would say, when we think about how do we create our future economy, do we want to have a sustainable economy, and how do we create that, how do we evaluate that, and what do we consider, as you said, life cycle costs from the start and potentially until recycling. You mentioned the example of a light bulb. I think it is very nice to illustrate the life cycle costing with that. But the question for me, the next one then would be is how do we apply it to more complex procurements, not like goods, but maybe works, construction, or even services. Do you have you thought about this in your research?
Of course, so you again pinpoint where this concept becomes more and more complex, and definitely assessing and collecting available data that we can depend really on when it comes to assessing services or huge construction infrastructure projects. It's more difficult for sure, but at the same time, this is where our collaboration, broadly speaking, in the market needs to be quite well established, I think, with scientists, because while on the procurement side, we tend to experience a challenge in assessing how you evaluate, how you really put a monetary price on things like CO2 emission, let's say, of the infrastructure project. But there are large amount, I would say, at this point, of methodologies that address this. Those methodologies are just for now not really aligned with what the law says. So beside the Article 68 pointing out what type of costs you can consider during your procurement process, Article 68 also elaborates what the methodology is or is to be for it to be compliant in the context of law. And there are several quite strong limitation and indication what the methodologies need to be. And we need to still, I believe personally, have a little bit more time, and the market needs to be nudged, and the contracting authorities need to collaborate with the suppliers to really be able to establish a very standardized methodologies that work well within procurements. But just to go back to your construction project question, well, I think that for example, things like energy efficiency emissions, there is right now on the market actually a fair bit of machines and tools and cars that can actually answer the need for reduced energy consumption and CO2 emissions levels. So there. The question is exactly how to enumerate that, and different contracting authorities for now already establishes the methodologies how to do so. However, where we lack still is a European-wide standardized methodologies that can be replicated and used on a large scale.
Thank you. This is very interesting when we look at the methodology and the measuring, and I think this, if I may, promotes another follow-on or follow-up question, which for me is, so you were talking about CO2 emissions, and that is very much the end of like having procured a project, I would say. But there is also the pre-award question, I would say. Like you mentioned the award criteria in Article 68 in the EU Public Procurement Directives, which require like a sustainable procurement at the outset. And then there, the question for me is like, how do we measure that? Like, what kind of labels do we allow? What kind of weighting do we need? And how does it interact and interfere with the end, so to say, measure of CO2 emissions?
So I think that what is important, if I understand your question correctly, is also to make sure that you don't double, so to speak, right? So that you don't evaluate and put monetary pricing, let's say on CO2 emission at the very beginning of stage, but then somehow you also calculate it at the end stage. There is for sure this challenge of exactly from which moment you measure those things and in what scale and what scope you include them within your public procurement. So for example, if we're looking at services, is it just limited the CO2 emission around the area where the product is, where the service is being performed, or is it also a transport, let's say, from the headquarters of the company to the site of the project, etc., etc. And there is a lot of variables, and for sure there are still quite complex, and we don't have very straightforward answer. And that is the reason that if you look on some of the statistical data that we currently have, and we don't have, again, very European-wide evaluation of life cycle costing yet. I just recently looked at the Danish report for last year, and they looked into how many times in all the public procurements that have been issued, how many times life cycle costing is mentioned. So it's also a very textual analysis. But even within that, it's very few times that life cycle costing is mentioned. And I think that ultimately the methodology, the challenges that you highlighted, very clearly are still there and somehow hinder a progression of application of these methodologies.
Thank you so much. If you don't mind, I would have like one last follow-up to this first question, which has been a bit extended, but I think it is very interesting to talk with you about that and to go a little bit more into detail. And that would be, you mentioned the total cost of ownership. How do these two concepts differ, and on which one should or do we rely for assessing sustainability in procurement?
That's a very good question. I think that, so let's start with maybe differentiating between the two concepts. Total cost of ownership ultimately is more focused on direct cost of the buyer. So all the actual cost that the contracting authority as a buyer is carrying out, and those are specifically elements related to things like maintenance, as I mentioned, servicing, delivery, for example, etc., etc. When we're starting to move from total cost of ownership to life cycle costing is when we're starting to assess the external environmental costs. So actually this element that currently poses the most challenges, right? So to what extent, let's say, production of the goods that we ultimately purchase, the CO2 emission during the manufacturing process, how much of those costs we as a buyer are willing to carry. Similarly, when it comes to disposal or recycling, etc., etc. So this element is where I would say the majority of challenge currently lies, to really create a clear borders of when something is still in procurement and we have a good standardized process and methodology for it, and at which point this is already something that stands outside of procurement relationship. So that would be the differentiation between two concepts. And what I hope that the listeners will be able to identify on that basis is also that those are not two separate, and it's, so to speak, or approach or total cost of ownership of life cycle costing. I rather see total cost of ownership as a type of pre-step before we advance, before we progress to life cycle costing. Similarly, as we moved from the lowest price of acquisition to right now, we're talking about lowest cost, which already is something higher than the acquisition price. Then we're moving to this concept of most economically advantageous tender. We're talking about total cost of ownership, life cycle assessment in some of them, and then we end up with this life cycle costing. So this is a concept for now to which we aspire, but it's not very present on the market currently.
Thank you so much. That was very interesting to have that discussion and distinction. And as I take, we should have an incremental or a stepwise approach towards life cycle costing, which probably also ensures the quality of having a good method ready, as you said, that will be created in or should be created in collaboration with the market and scientists.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. So now I would actually move on to the second guiding question, and that would be, do you consider the life cycle costing approach as a success so far or as a failure?
I think that this is quite loaded question because if we refer to what I just mentioned earlier on, that it's not really used extensively on the market, that would be a suggestion that it is a failure. But at the same time, as I mentioned, I think that is an aspirational methodology. And this is something that we need a little bit more time to get there. But it could be assessed as a failure because one and only mandatory LCC approach that we had under European Union law have been on clean vehicles. And that methodology actually with the update of the vehicles directive have been substantially changed, and the approach from very established methodology have been changed to actually setting targets. And I think that that is a very good indication of the fact that this is quite complex, and because we're dealing with so many different jurisdiction practices, it's quite problematic to get there. So from the perspective of where we are, where our ambitions have been, for example, with the clean vehicles, we're not there yet, and that could be accounted as a type of failure. But I'm quite optimistic. I think that there is a lot of very positive movement happening on the market. We just need to align those things together. And one of the solutions or one of the nudges to see life cycle costing as more successful could be actually within the Green Deal plans of introducing more and more sectoral mandatory green provisions, which ultimately can lead potentially to establishing a more standardized LCC methodologies and the obligatory character of applying them.
Thank you so much. You're pointing to a very good point, that the elements or the sustainability or LLC is not mandatory yet. Is this, would you consider, is this part of the success story or part of the, if you want to put it in those words, failure of life cycle costing?
To be honest, I think that rolling out on large scale obligatory life cycle costing across all sectors would be premature. I think that majority of buyers in Europe are not ready to do that. They don't have enough capacities to actually on their own be able to carry out this assessment. It will be quite burdensome. But I do think that how it sounds from the Commission communication, trying to establish some of those methodologies in specific sectors on the basis of the guidelines and methodologies established, rolled out, and tested by the EU as a general application across member state could be a good approach. But that just to say that I do think that for now, life cycle costing broadly as a principle, or as a provision under the directive, should be voluntary. But I do hope in the years to come to see a more sectoral mandatory approach to this. More successful, hopefully, than the clean vehicles.
Great, thank you so much. You mentioned the sectors. What and how would you think should it be applied to different sizes and firms? So small enterprises is a bit question, right? How can they even comply with very high requirements in terms of like measuring life cycle costing? What is your opinion on that?
Um, my opinion might be a little bit not practical or not being really possible, maybe in some of our viewers' perspectives, because what I think is because we're rolling out more and more requirements and we're putting more and more burden on the buyer, I think that member states and the Commission should establish a type of bodies that would be helpful in doing so. In other words, you mentioned labels. I think that labels from perspective of buyers are great, because you're outsourcing in a way the type of assessments, the sustainable assessments that you're not able to carry out yourself, to a body that is really specialized in that. But at the same time, we need to be mindful of the European Union free movement rules. So in other words, you need to allow equivalence documentation. And the problem is, from perspective of analyzing application of things like labels, which are connected, of course, to life cycle costing, is that the moment that you allow equivalence, it's very difficult, I think, for the buyer to establish and make sure that they don't compare, apples and oranges, right? And who is to do that? It's again quite problematic. So there should be a body, I think, that assists in doing the evaluation of equivalences within the sustainable assessments. So the small and medium enterprises, the startups, still have an access, and it's not being perceived as a type of restriction to enter the procurement market. There's for sure a need here to create a different possibilities. From the buyer's perspective, to allow more and more application of solely labels, because that will speed up the process. It will be more standardized. We'll be able to achieve more, I think, with this approach. But from the supplier's perspective, there needs to be a solution in which small and medium enterprises are not limited, because actually our market, the European market, is predominantly small and medium enterprises. So we need to put extra attention to facilitate for their participation in public procurement. Also in context of things like assessment, life cycle assessments, labels, etc.
I think your statement summarizes very nicely that we have a constant balancing going on in public procurement, balancing between large firms and small firms, balancing between economic and cost balancing of having other goals like social or environmental goals, and how do we strike that balance. And law is one means in this whole calculation and game, but there can be many different aspects like policy or like you mentioned, scientific methods on how to even do it, how to even assess those life cycle costs. And then I would like to come to the last question, which is very much an open question, and where I would also invite you to elaborate and maybe mention the things that you would like to have in this talk. And that is, what is the future of life cycle costing in your perspective?
To be honest, I'm looking to the future quite positively. I think in a span of just the last decade, the conversation broadly about place of sustainable consideration in European public procurement really moved quite dynamically. So obviously this has been a topic that have been actually for a couple of decades right now consider how much green, how much social. But last 10 years, I really think brought a lot of interesting cases, a lot of interesting solutions that have been implemented in public procurement directives. Of course, as any act, there is a lot of compromises within how those provisions are worded, which ultimately leads to the fact that there are some legal questions. But to your point, I think it's also very important to recognize and remember that legally compliant procurement at the same time may not necessarily be economically or even goal-orientated from that perspective, viable procurement. So there's always this need to acknowledge that those are just tools and they need to be used in cohesion. So on the one hand side, the life cycle cost needs to be legally compliant, but at the same time, for the way how it to be carried through in a true manner, we need economists, we need collaboration also with the scientists who really know how to do it properly. And I think that that's what future holds. I think that I'm quite positive and keep waiting to see more and more standardized European life cycle costing methodologies that we will be able to apply broadly in different sectors, and assess and test and also acquire much more data, because this is also the element that we continue to received as a point of criticism, that we promote sustainable public procurement very broadly, but there is not enough data to really substantiate those claims. They are more smaller case basis, and we need more data. And for that, things like the methodologies and development of them will be very helpful. So I do think that that's what future holds, more standardized methodologies that we can really use. And then, of course, case law in discussing how this is applicable or not, where are the boundaries, and so on.
Perfect, thank you so much. So this place actually is a nice, I would say, circle back to my own PhD work, where sustainable procurement is part of it, and the assessment of sustainable procurement in Swiss public procurement law. And the big point that I'm making is data, because I will do a lot of data analysis. And as you said at the beginning, it is often just a question of language or text analysis to see which procurements do even require sustainable procurement, and also to get the facts straight. As you said, like when you look into EU public procurement reports, the same also holds true for Switzerland. Is for example, the claim in Switzerland was, we are doing great public procurement, 70%, and then the small part that was assessed for whatever reason had those criteria in there. But this is only a sample, so to say, and we need to scale it. We need to understand what is the big impact, and also what is on the paper and what is actually happening. So like, do we only require it at the award process, or do we also assess if we actually followed through at the end of the project?
That's a very good point that you're making, because it's also then a question of ensuring that we're not dealing with greenwashing. That is, that we have a large number to promote, and cities being very proud of themselves that they do, let's say 70% of their procurements are green procurements, but that is something that you ticked and analyzed the text of those procurements. But did anyone actually do audits? Did anyone actually check that those things actually have been carried out and they met the goals or the assumptions that are made at the beginning of the process, right? And that is when we definitely need people like yourself and the project of your PhD that is very interesting, that hopefully in upcoming years we'll get more and more data to be able to really work with.
Thank you so much, Marta, for this great interview. And I think it fits very nicely with our following speakers. Marc Steiner is a judge at the Swiss Public Procurement Law. He's at the Swiss Federal Administrative Court. So we will be talking about case law, as you said, which is a big open question still. And we will also have an American perspective on it. And of course, an economist who will be talking about how to measure sustainability. So I am very glad that you were here, and we're elaborating this very complex concept. And I do hope that your wish for a more standardized approach and methodology for life cycle costing will come true, and that we will have a better databases very soon.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Marc Steiner, I'm really happy that you're here today with me and are available to answer a couple of my questions. So Marc Steiner, thank you so much. Marc Steiner is a specialist in public procurement law and a very known promoter of sustainable procurement in Switzerland. He is judge at the Swiss Federal Administrative Court and is writing judgments in public procurement. So today we will focus on sustainable procurement and also about regulation, how it came about in Switzerland, and of course his expertise in judicial decision making. Starting with the first question that I have for you, Marc, is so we know that Switzerland has adopted a new law in January 1st, 2021. And one of the regulation changes were that purchasing authorities need also to consider sustainable procurement, both environmental and social sustainability. So what are the goals of the new regulation?
That's really interesting. Thank you so much for asking that question, because it gives me the opportunity to show a real paradigm change. Because in the 90s, we had a law dealing with market access, competition, money, and nothing else, basically. And the new law has an entirely different mindset, saying, hey guys, we have a new aim and purpose of the law, which means it's the use of public funds considering sustainability issues. So the use of public funds and sustainabilities are thought together. And that's interesting. So it's the same aim and purpose on the reasonable use of public funds and sustainability issues. And this will give the whole thing, let's say, a new spirit. And together with this goes the idea of the most advantageous tender, which is not the most economically advantageous tender, but the most advantageous, which means it's not so much competition based on price, but competition based on quality. And the new aim and purpose and this notion of most advantageous tender together are bringing the paradigm change.
Thank you very much, Marc, for this introduction. I think what this leads me to is my second question, namely, what is your opinion, or how do we understand this new sustainability? Do we understand it as mandatory or as a voluntary requirement in the new regulation in Switzerland?
It's basically both. It's mandatory in so far as the legal minimum requirements are defined as exclusion grounds. So if you don't fulfill this, you're out as a bidder. So in that way, the sustainability issues are mandatory, and there are social minimum standards, especially ILO core labor standards, but also environmental minimal standards in terms of environmental public international law, copying the model of the European directives on minimum standards. So the environmental part of it is a copy-paste of the EU directives. And this is new for Switzerland, the environmental part of it. We knew beforehand already social minimum standards, but the environmental minimum standards as exclusion grounds, this is a new feature of the new law. That's for the mandatory part. And the other things, that's a margin of appreciation. So what do you use as technical specifications? You have a wide margin of appreciation. Same thing is true for award criteria. So in that terms, the new law gives you, let's say, liberties, let's say margin of appreciation, let's say a level playing field, but it's not mandatory in a legal term as we understand it. But if you have a new aim and purpose on sustainability, this means that you should move forward using more of this margin of appreciation. The point is, and if you consider that, it's definitely not mandatory that this margin of appreciation does not undergo judicial review. You have, when you, let's say, as a procuring entities, you use your margin of appropriation, that's something the judge cannot interfere with. So that's also an argument against the mandatory nature of those, let's say, margins of appreciation or level playing field when using ability criteria, technical specifications, and award criteria. That might be a first overview on the system.
Thank you so much, Marc. This already got into a lot of details. And I would like to ask one follow-up question. When we were talking about the mandatory part of sustainability, you were referring to the EU minimum standards. Could you give a concrete example what this would mean? Like, what do we consider? Do we consider emissions and labels? What would be the minimum? And what would be the add-on, the nice to have under the voluntary requirements? Do we know that?
Yes, so on the mandatory minimum requirements, you have to imagine public international law standards on using dirty materials, for instance. So some forbidden chemicals or stuff like this. This is a classical minimum standard. If you don't fulfill this, you're out, because this public international law standard in environmental terms is considered equal to ILO core labor standards in social terms. It's a kind of pendant, as you would call it in French. You have the ILO core labor standards as a qualified form as social public international law, and those Stockholm Convention and stuff like this as qualified public international law standards, which you have to fulfill everywhere in the supply chain throughout the world. That's the interesting point. And if you go for technical specifications or for award criteria, you can add on top of that an award criterion, for instance, for CO2 emissions level. And if there are less emissions, you have more points and stuff like this you can play with. But that's not mandatory. As we explained before, this is a kind of level playing field where you can, let's say, give extra points for especially good performance in environmental terms.
Thank you very much for this clarification. I think there's probably still a little bit refining to do on the sides of authorities, and I really
definitely yes.
Yeah, and we all hope that we will become a little smarter over time. And so researchers and judges are helping with this process. I'm glad that that we are working towards that. And then I would like to go to my third question, which is some people say that environmental sustainability and the reduction of emissions should be addressed in a separate regulation rather than within the context of public procurement law. What is your opinion on that?
Yes, I know. This was one of the famous arguments of neoliberalism of the 90s, but let's face the truth. Fact is that the government procurement agreement allows for more space on production methods, because in government procurement agreement, you don't give an import ban or import restrictions to the private trade. That would be a regulation, and then the normal WTO law rules on PPMs would apply. But in public procurement, you don't regulate private trade, but you express your consumer preference. That's a non-regulatory behavior. And this allows for more policy space. And so the argument you refer to would hinder me to take profit or advantage of that policy space, which would just be stupid, because there is a difference between regulating private trade and expressing public consumer choices. I mean, you cannot compare this. So the argument is, from a world trade perspective, absolutely flawed. And it wants to hinder public authorities of the policy space they can make use of in conformity with world trade law. This is the wonderful things, because otherwise the EU directives would be illegal from a government procurement agreement WTO perspective, and this can't obviously be the case, at least according to me.
Thank you so much, Mark. I think you summarized a lot of very complex issues in that one question. I think especially for maybe like a theoretical academic audience, I would almost say that the first one, when we talk about trade, is command and control regulation, which forces market players to obey a rule, basically. And the one that you mentioned would be more of like a behavioral economics, a nudge, or like an incentive for authorities to be kind of incentivized to integrate sustainability into their decision making. I think this is a very interesting approach.
Absolutely. From a legal perspective, you make a comparable distinction. You say you're acting iure imperii, which is regulatory, or iure gestionis, which is like a merchant. And if you are doing public procurement, you don't regulate, but you're acting like a merchant. This is iure gestionis. And if you make that difference, you come to similar conclusions as if you would distinguish economic behavior game to regulatory, let's say, structure of public behavior.
Yeah, that is
Isn't that very interesting?
Yeah, indeed. And so, but then you would give basically the authorities the option to act, right? And you would give them through the
as a consumer.
As a consumer, exactly.
Yeah.
And you would give them guidance to what they need to integrate with the new public procurement law when it comes to sustainability.
That would be the path to follow, and say how far you can go and where are you abusing public procurement to educate enterprises beyond the purpose of public procurement. There it gets difficult, because this leads in effects to regulatory behavior. But if you limit yourself to the public procurement process, then you can go pretty far, because consumer choice allows for more policy space than regulation.
I agree. That is I think we need to let it sit, because it's a very important distinction in law and also in policy making, whether you force and command or whether you incentivize and give space for choice.
Couldn't agree more.
And then I would like to come to the fourth question, which is targeted toward your authority or your expertise in as a judge. Which is namely whether and how you think that this new sustainability in regulation will impact decision making. And of course, you will speak in your personal express your personal opinion and not the opinion of the court.
So this is an interesting point, because after the German Supreme Court decision on climate protection measures, there is a Supreme Court judgment of the German Supreme Court in Karlsruhe saying, hey, the German authorities are not doing enough to protect the youngsters from the consequences of climate change. So the climate policy of the German government is not ambitious enough. So that, I would say, is real judicial activism. In Switzerland, you would never see that, in my view, because we have another understanding of the relationships between parliament, government, and judiciary, basically. To explain that would take half an hour. I spare you that for that. But what I can tell you is that if the public authorities are enjoying a margin of appreciation, the logical consequence is that the judge will refrain from interfere with this margin of appreciation. So the real public procurement policy making is done by the government and the administration and not by the judges. But what can change judges' behavior is the new catalog of aim and purposes, because in Switzerland we are very used to take every little argument back to aims and purposes of public procurement regulation. This is an absolutely common method of interpretation of each this norm of each little tiny problem in public procurement. How does this fit with aims and purposes in Article 2? So if you add to aims and purposes a new one, which is called sustainability when using public funds, so this might have an influence on the judge's attitude when discussing the different problems in a practical manner. So there is a new, let's say, a new additive in the cake.
Mm-hmm. A new guiding principle when you make your decision.
And this definitely makes a difference. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have one last critical follow-up question on what you said. So when you say, like, because of the margin of appreciation, the decision is most of the time left with the authorities. So it could mean that there's less review. Does this also mean that the rule of law is challenged by this large margin of appreciation?
I wouldn't say so, because you have the structure of award criterion. You know what can be allowed in terms of an award criterion, or in terms of technical specifications, or in terms of ability test, and each of those has its legal structure, and this legal structure limits the margin of appreciation. And the second thing is you have also those aims and purposes interfering with the design of technical specifications, ability criteria, and award criteria, because if you go in favor for sustainability in a way that isn't in conformity with the competition aim and purpose, then you have to make a balance between those purposes, and the judge might be tempted to say, hey guys, this is too much in terms of sustainable procurement, because it limits the competition to a degree which is not acceptable.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't say that the rule of law suffers when allowing margins of appreciation. This is, by the way, not only the concept of the new law, but also of the old one. So in this respect, nothing does change.
Yeah, I agree. And so now this is really my last one. You talked about, like, balancing, and I think it's an important point.
Definitely.
Do you have a personal view on how much, for example, competition or price should be weighted, and how much quality and sustainability? Do you have, like, an experience value, and not speaking as a judge, but speaking as a public procurement expert?
So the first thing the court has said is that all aims and purposes are equal. So the best value for money is not more important than competition, for instance, or more important than transparency. So it's a clear-cut jurisprudence that says all aims and purposes are equal. And for the new law, even the dispatch of the Federal Council already says so as an expression of the government's opinion that they share the court's view that those aims and purposes are equal. So that's the first thing you clearly have in mind when approaching those cases, that the aims and purposes are equal. Second thing is that there is jurisprudence of the Swiss Federal Supreme Court in Lausanne saying you have a minimum weight of the price of 20%. So even if you use sustainability criteria and you have a very complex public procurement, because the complexity of the public procurement is decisive when expressing a view on how much the price must be given weight. So the more complex the public procurement is, the less weight of a price is admissible. And the Swiss Federal Court in Lausanne says 20% is the minimum.
Which still leaves 30% for quality and sustainability and other criteria, right?
Yes, that would be an hour's lecture. I spare you this, but just to have as a basic knowledge, those 20% minimum on price, I think this will be the same for the new law. But there are, of course, stakeholders hoping that the Federal Supreme Court will give up this. So well, we are we are in suspense on awaiting the first decisions of the Supreme Court on that. But my personal, let's say, guess is that they will maintain that.
That was a very good, I think, last word, suspense. We're all waiting how sustainability will be implemented, both at the executive side through the authorities. We now have a decision by the legislative, so we have a new law. And then, of course, then we are waiting for how the judicial branch will deal with these decisions. But as we said, and as you discussed, most of the weight will be on the public authorities to integrate and to implement this new law. And on that note, I would like to thank you a lot. And I'm very happy that you participated in this panel. Thank you so much, Marc.
Real pleasure. Bye.
Bye. Carine Staropoli, I'm very glad that you're here with me today, and we'll be talking about the economic aspect of green public procurement.
Hello, Désirée. Hello, all.
Carine Staropoli is a professor of economics at the Paris School of Economics and kindly agreed today to answer 3 questions that relate to publications that we will see soon. So they're not published yet, but they're about to come out. So I'm really glad that she's sharing her knowledge with us today. And I would like to dive into the first question. So the first question is related to one of your soon being published papers, which is, what is the idea of a simplified auction to promote green public procurement?
Okay, so this paper is a joint paper actually with Isaac Olave, who is a PhD student at the University Paris Dauphine. And we had the opportunity to work on Colombian data on procurement. What is very interesting with the situation in Colombia is the fact that Colombia first is involved in greening the procurement policy. And in the same time, they are also in the process of digitalizing the procurement. They clearly consider now that GPP, as in many countries, notably European countries, is an instrument for environmental policy, and they committed to make public procurement more green, although yet it's not no more than 3%, 3.5% of the contract can be considered as green. For that, they have decided, thanks to the digitalization, to simplify the auction process. That means to make it short and to decrease the administrative burden. So the objective is also indirectly to reduce the transaction cost of the procurement itself. So what they have done is that they have basically introduced two types of threshold. So the open auction being the standard way of procurement, procuring the good, but they have introduced one threshold which define what is called the minor amount auction, and it's a restricted auction. So that means that the public buyer can randomly draw back up to 10 suppliers among those that have expressed interest in participating to the procurement, and disqualify the rest of the participants. So by doing so, by taking this restricted auction, they reduce ex ante the transaction cost at the awarding stage of the process. And then there's this second type of auction, which is called the minimum amount. And in that case, it's clearly a fast track open auction. So that means that suppliers don't have to send documentation unless the financial capacity to be able to apply, and only the price is scrutinized. And in that case, obviously, it reduces not only the transaction cost, but also the delays, because the publication of the winners only takes 2 weeks instead of something like 2 months. So these two new type of auction are clearly simplification of the open auction, which is the standard one. And what we want to address in this paper is whether by reducing the transaction cost of the procurement process through these two new auction, it helps or it encourages public buyer to uptake GPP, which we assume, as it is the case in the literature, increases transaction costs. So clearly, it's a kind of compensation by simplifying the procurement process itself through simplification auction, simplified auction. You are able to compensate the extra cost that is occurred by green public procurement or green products.
Thank you very much. So what Carine just shared with us is a very good summary of a complicated public procurement process, and also to include not only efficiency but sustainability into public procurement. And I have one question with regard to this minimum amount. Namely, you said that the fast-track open auction would only rely on price. How would then the agency be able to include sustainability if the contract is only awarded on price?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. In that case, it might put in the title, I mean, as a mandatory characteristics of the good itself, that the product, usually it would be a product, but also a service or the work, why not, is considered as to be green. So that means defining clearly in the title of the procurement the green characteristics of the procured good or service or work. But based on that, the criteria that will be analyzed is the price.
Okay.
And of course, this concerns the smallest amount of contracts, because you can do that in very simple and standardized, I would say, contract.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that is a very interesting approach, to basically require it from the outset that only green contracts will be accepted, and then award according to the lowest price within this selection of green contract offers, so to say. Mm-hmm. Very good. Okay, thank you for the explanation. And then I would like to go to the second question, which is one that interested me myself in my research, and I've written a paper on, is like how you measure green public procurement. I would be very curious to understand how you measured in your papers the sustainability criterion.
Yeah, so as an applied economist and that try to deal with data, that's of course the first and foremost questions. What do I consider as green in my data? And unfortunately, as you know, Désirée, this type of data is difficult to have it clean and sure. So it really depends. In the Colombian cases, what we have been able to deal with is self-declaration by public buyers of whether or not, I mean, it's a dummy variable, whether or not the contract can be considered as green or not by including green criteria, but we don't know precisely the level of greenness, if I may, of the specific contract. And in the French data, which is based on the publication of the call for tender in the BOMP, so in the official journal of publication for the call for tenders, what we did is that we, through data scrapping, we identified using text analytics the main words that can qualify a contract, a call for tender, more precisely, as green in the title and in the award criteria, which are the only data available that we have. We don't have the technical specification. We don't have other aspect of the contract or the call for tender. So that's what we do. We have identified a list based on notably the EU green criteria that have been identified, and we qualify a contract as green when there are one or more of these words in the title or the award criteria. So that's somehow unsatisfying in the sense that we know that the question of how much is it green and what's the real impact, environmental impact of the product, the good or the service would be much better. But for the moment, in the absence of precise data, that's what we do in order to qualify a contract as green. As a control variable, we also qualify the greenness of a call for tender, in the sense that if the common product, so the CPV code, the common procurement vocabulary, which help to identify what type of product it is part of the 20 categories of product that have been identified as in the green criteria of the EU, we say that the call for tender or the observation is easily greened, in the sense that it's easy to make it green, since the officials at the purchasing department have the know-how or have the tools about how to make it green. So that's another variable that we try to measure.
That is a very interesting approach, and as you can or as we discussed also at other occasions, it is approximation. It is very difficult to measure sustainability, and I've also talked to Marta, our other speaker, about this. So it is often right now the best way to do it is to approach the process, the procurement process, and measure how green it is, as you did it by text analysis. And then the next level and step would be how green is the product, what is the outcome, and then of course like CO2 emissions, etc., will play a role. But currently this is very difficult because this outcome is to my knowledge not published anywhere, at least, or like required, at least not in the EU or in Switzerland or France for that matter. So
Indeed.
yeah, so we will hope for more transparency and push and promote for more transparency, not only for the sake of data analysis, but of course for the sake of green public procurement. And then I would like to come to the third and last of my questions. You have also written a paper which will soon be published about the politics in green public procurement. So the question there will be, how does politics play into promoting green public procurement according to your view?
Yeah, so this work is a joint work with Julie Rouault from the Sorbonne Business School. And what we try to do is actually to test for the intuition we have that politics may play a role in GPP uptake. Once again, we're really in the phase of GPP uptake and trying to better understand the determinant of the GPP uptake. And the literature, which is growing on this question, has never introduced political variable into the explanation. So that's what we do in this paper using French data. And the idea, as it has been done for another choice that public entities have to do, which is the make or buy decision for public service provision, we try to explain the GPP or not GPP uptake decision, because it's still a voluntary choice to uptake GPP, by including a number of political variables that are linked to first the ideology or the partisanship that is proxied by the political affiliation of the mayor. We only consider local municipality data. And we also try to value not only the ideology, but what is called the political interest of the politician, which would be or can be assimilated in the literature to a kind of pragmatism, in the sense that a politician, he can either choose his policy based on his ideology, but we know that ideology is more or less, I mean, it's not clear-cut all the time for all the topics, but sometimes he can refer to pragmatism, and since he has an interest in being re-elected, we can assume that, trying to please his voters by choosing some policies that are that may make the voters satisfied, and that's the case of environmental policy. So what we take as a proxy of this political strategy variable is whether or not, or how much the voters are sensitive to environmental policies by introducing the scores of the green parties in the European election, but we are planning to introduce also in the municipal election, and to take that as a proxy of the voter sensitivity towards environmental policy. And actually, we are able to show that ideology doesn't explain GPP uptake, whether or not it's a left wing or right wing or other type of parties in the political parties, doesn't explain the GPP uptake. Instead, this voter sensibility for environmental policy, that means political strategy, explain or is significant in order to explain GPP uptake by politicians, at least using French data at the local level, that means at the municipality levels.
This is, thank you so much, Carine. This is a very interesting finding, especially because even though political or third-party opportunism has been considered for efficiency questions in earlier literature, I think this is one of the first or earlier publications on how politics plays into green public procurement and sustainability. So I think this is a very important contribution, and I'm very much looking forward to the publication of this paper. And maybe to conclude, so first of all, of course, I would thank Carine a lot for being part of this panel on green public procurement. And as a last question, I would just ask you, what would you hope for, or what would be your wishes to promote green public procurement, maybe from an economic view or economist's view?
Well, I think that we really need to have better data to be able to better comprehend the phenomenon and whether it's worth it, because from an economic efficiency perspective, the real question that I have not yet addressed in my papers is really the cost effectiveness of green public procurement. So the more we will have clear data, as you mentioned, on the real environmental impact of green public procurement, the better it will be to justify the fact to use green public procurement as an instrument of environmental policy, because it is clear that there are other types of environmental policies, more classical, more standard, based on subsidies, based on taxation, based on incentives. And the efficiency condition of green public procurement being an efficient instrument are still to be really measured in order to justify and to deploy and to implement this type of policy. So I think it's important to have good data, being able to clearly identify what is green procurement and what is not a green procurement, and be able exposed to measure the impact of this procurement.
Very good. Me personally doing also some data analysis, I'm also hoping for more transparency. And luckily we have a requirement in the GPA, in the government procurement agreement, which requires authorities to publish data. But so far this publication has been focused on the pre-award and award stage and not on the post-award stage. So we very much hope that this will change politically, and that there will be more chance for scientists to analyze data and how well green public procurement is actually performed, and to have a benchmarking and standard to measure that. So
thank you very much, Dorothée. Désirée.
No worries. Thank you very much. On that note, I wish you a very good day, and thank you for being part of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hello, Steve. Very nice to have you here today.
Great to be with you today.
Thank you so much. So Steve Schooner is my fourth interviewee. He has kindly volunteered to speak on this panel, Green Public Procurement. He is a professor of law at the George Washington University, and an expert, the expert, as would say, in public procurement law, together, of course, with his colleagues. And so I would like to jump into the question. As with all of the other interviewees, I will ask them three guiding or leading questions. Of course, I would allow some follow-up questions. And coming to the first one, So we all know that America has a new administration, President Joe Biden, and he has announced to procure electric vehicles for the US government. Does this constitute a milestone, a shift in the American approach to sustainable procurement?
So I think the short answer is it is a shift, but I think the shift is actually more significant than that. I mean, let's just be clear about what's going on. The prior administration withdrew from the Paris Agreement. So remember, the first thing that the Biden administration did was bring the United States back into the Paris Agreement, and I think that was important. In addition, in late January, the president issued an executive order on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. So this is part of a large strategic initiative, and it's a significant priority for this administration. Now, I love the question because you ask, the president's talking about replacing hundreds of thousands of electric vehicles with electric vehicles. Some people think many as 600,000 vehicles. So now we see whether it's talk or whether it's action. One of the most interesting case studies right now is the Postal Service, which is replacing a huge number of vehicles. And there's a fair amount of disagreement as to whether those will be EVs or not. But one of the issues that reminds us of is it's one thing to buy vehicles, it's another thing as to whether you can use them, because you may not have charging stations everywhere you need them. For the Postal Service, remember, much of the mail that gets delivered is in rural areas. This is a very big country. We don't have the charging station capacity right now for all mail services to only be electric. So I think we have our work cut out for us. I like the rhetoric that we've gotten on that, but we'll know in a year or two how many electric vehicles we've actually bought.
That's great. Thank you, Steve. What is your opinion? Do you think this will be limited to the area of vehicles, or is there any attempt to kind of broaden this to other sectors?
Oh, the executive order is extremely broad, and I think that the Presidential Task Force on Climate Change is serious. And frankly, I think that there's going to be some dramatic changes. But I do think that the change management issues with regard to sustainable procurement are going to be difficult. I mean, we have our work cut out for us.
This actually leads me to my second question, change management, right? So we know that the Federal Acquisition Regulation has provisions on sustainable acquisition policy. One of it is, for example, asking the procurement authorities to make sure that 95% of the contracts are green in some way. And here my question is, has this been working? And if yes, how?
So this is what we'll call the bad news, good news session of our discussion. The Federal Acquisition Regulations guidance on environmentally preferable purchases is largely unhelpful and ignored. The information and specifically the legal references in there are old and out of date. And sadly, it takes a long time to update or fix the regulations in the FAR. Even more frustrating, while it has some general statements, the average contracting officer in the United States doesn't know what they're supposed to do based on the regulations. So you may want something, but you haven't told me how to do it or what not to do. So it's going to take a while to change that. Now, on a more positive note, there are many other non-FAR-based resources in the United States that are terrific. So for example, at the GSA, our General Services Administration, they have a wonderful resource called the Green Procurement Compilation, the GSA Green Procurement Compilation. And if you stick that into your web browser, it'll pop right up. And there's a big overview on buying and selling with regard to environmentally preferable purchases. At our EPA, our Environmental Protection Agency, they have something called the Comprehensive Procurement Guidelines Program. So the EPA Comprehensive Procurement Guidelines Program, another good webpage. But we have some things that we do rather well. In information technology, we have what we call our Energy Star program. That's basically our Eco label or green label for IT. And then there's the LEED buildings, LEED, Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. So I think we're doing a lot of good things, and there's a lot of groundwork that's been done, but you're not going to find it in the Federal Acquisition Regulation. And the average procurement official in the United States has no idea what they're supposed to do. And hopefully that'll change sooner rather than later.
Thank you so much, Steve. So what we have is like we have a lot of ingredients, and the question is now, how do we add them together to actually create the meal of green public procurement, I would say. And so this leads me to the question, do we have an overview? Do we have data, and how many contracts are actually green in some way or another? And what are the different authorities? How are they doing on that kind of benchmark?
I think the short answer is we don't have that data. So we may have some data, but I have no reason to believe it's accurate. And I don't think that the measurement mechanisms or rubrics are very good right now. To the extent we're talking about some of these electronic tools, however, there's a wonderful tool that GSA has now to help you calculate your own carbon footprint, which I think is helpful. And many of the leading firms in the United States have been working towards trying to seek a competitive advantage by articulating the environmental benefits of their products or their services. But look, there's plenty of opportunities for change here. I mean, I think there's some easy things that we can do, and we may or may not need the regulations to do them or not. But for example, we talked about Energy Star and LEED. It's not difficult to say, you only buy Energy Star compliant information technology. You only build new buildings that are LEED compliant. But I think the real thing that you're trying to get to is we need to fundamentally rethink our measurement or our metrics tools. In other words, as we know from experience, in procurement, as in bureaucracy, as in life, what gets measured gets managed, okay? So what do we measure procurement officials on? Well, we tend to measure them on whether they got good prices. So the first thing we have to do is we have to overcome the tyranny of low price. We have to convince every procurement official in the country and the people that they work for that low prices aren't going to help us solve our problems. So what we really need to start doing is thinking more economically about procurement. And what that means for most of us is thinking in terms of life cycle cost or total cost of ownership rather than purchase prices. And that's not difficult. But once we make the decision to have an intelligent conversation about life cycle costing or total cost of ownership, then we can include externalities, or what we might call the effects, the harms of carbon in the procurement. So why do you pay less for a fossil fuel solution? Because fossil fuels have been subsidized for generations, which is why we have a climate change problem. So my government, your government, every government around the world has to embrace the willingness to pay more for a more environmentally friendly solution. And I think once we do that, we'll make some progress. But we can do this. We can do it. It'll take time.
I think this is a very interesting point. So what you just mentioned at the end, right now we think that buying green is more expensive. And actually one of the speakers, or at least there's a tendency towards thinking that this might be more expensive. So Carine Staropoli, who's also a speaker of today's panel, she will publish a paper very soon that discusses the option, at least, that it might not necessarily be more expensive when we talk about life cycle costing, etc. Right? When we take the maintenance into account, for example, of the building and the energy use, etc.
But it's even a stronger argument than that. And there's actually two different components to it. One is, as markets change, we don't need to assume that the environmentally preferable solution is going to be more expensive, because there may be new technologies and new vendors that may not actually cost more in terms of purchase prices. And we may see that with economies of scale, and those markets will shift in the next couple of years. But the point you just made a moment ago is the one that's so incredibly important. And that is, if I'm a government, not a consumer, right? Not an individual consumer, but a government, When I buy something, I'm also responsible for the environmental harms. And if I pay a little bit more for everything I buy, but I end up having less pollution, and therefore I have lower healthcare costs, I don't lose access to my port cities because there's less flooding, I don't have food shortages and migrations, refugee migrations, which lead to war, I am much better off economically, socially, globally, as a community, because I've managed the externalities. And one of the reasons that climate change is the problem it is we have focused on purchase prices without holding manufacturers and providers responsible for those externalities. So we're really going to need what we call change management, but we need to reorient our thinking about what it means to buy responsibly. But that's a great point.
Absolutely. So rethinking is a very good point in terms of like content. What do we want to integrate into our public contracts, right? Have you, or are they also thoughts about to change procurement procedures to implement that change? Or is it really more of a focus on the award criteria of what we want to buy?
So I really don't think the procedures need to be changed that dramatically. But as you say, evaluation criteria, right? So what do I evaluate you on? I evaluate you on your quality. I evaluate you on your price. I evaluate you on your reliability. But I think I also need to evaluate from a positive and a negative perspective the degree of environmental harm or benefit associated with your solution. And so again, I think I should discount any price premium I pay for something that pollutes less. Now, one other thing that we haven't spoken about, and this is particularly true with regard to infrastructure, is part of environmentally preferable procurement and part of climate change is thinking about resilience. And what that means is climate change is a reality, and frankly, there is going to be more flooding on the coasts, and it is going to be more hot in the desert. And we may need to purchase different goods and services and infrastructure to deal with much higher temperature, more flooding, different usage, greater demands at different times. So I think the growing literature on resilient cities and resilient infrastructure is also going to play a big role in the future.
Absolutely. I think especially this flooding of the coast you mentioned might be a big point and a big issue also for the US Army, who is one of the largest purchasers in the United States, because they, of course, they have many ports, they have access points that are very important.
So this is a terrific issue, but it's even broader than that. So our Navy, which does, of course, have ports on both coasts, east and west, is very focused on climate change. But the other thing you have to keep in mind, if you read the defense literature with regard to climate change, our military is planning to defend an ocean at the top of the globe that didn't used to be an ocean. As the northern ice melts, there will be passage in a place on this planet where there has never been passage before. And not only will passage be significant, but the access to the oil reserves in the northern part of the planet is going to be a hotly contested issue. And in Michael Clare's book, All Hell Breaking Loose, which is about the defense perspective on climate change, he spends a fair amount of time on this. And I can tell you, these are serious, serious issues.
Thank you so much on answering on that question. I only have one, well, let's say two last ones. One that is a follow-up, and then the phasing out question. So the follow-up for me would be on measuring. You talked about labels, CO2 emissions. If I bring social cost of carbon into this mix, how do you think we should best measure? Are we fine with labels? Do we need CO2 emissions? What is your opinion on that?
The short answer is it's very difficult. So I was in a program earlier this week, and one of the things that we were talking about is green labels and eco labels. In the United States, there are currently 400 eco labels. Obviously, that's a very, very mixed message. And one of the concerns with green labels and eco labels is the idea or the concern about greenwashing. If I can put a label on it, then I can probably get away with other potential evaluation, other environmental harms. So we need to be a little bit careful about just buying the green sticker. But as you said, one of the challenges here is there's so many different harms that we need to address that we need to be sophisticated about it. So yes, in some contexts, we do have to measure carbon output, carbon reduction, carbon capture, whatever it is. But I think you can't overgeneralize for all procurements, but I think we're going to have a number of different measures to focus on. As you know, one of the most interesting initiatives around the world in the last decade has been the open contract data standard. Well, the reality is there's a global conversation on procurement data, but they're not thinking about it yet from a scientific and technical externality standpoint. So that'll be another challenge for them as well. We have our work cut out for us. You said you had one more question.
Yeah, so the last question would be, even though I would love to dwell more into this, but I will stick to our plan, is what would you currently change and what would you improve on sustainability in government procurement in the United States?
I think the easiest way to think about that, particularly since we talked about measurement earlier in rethinking, is we need clear, strong leadership from the top down. We need people like the president, the heads of agencies, to send a clear message to their procurement professionals. This matters. This is important. I will applaud you when you do this. I will penalize you when you don't. I think we should have senior leaders creating environmentally preferable or sustainable procurement awards. We should be showing the people that are doing the right things, holding them out as case studies, and then saying, look, here's an example of a procurement where we're proud of what our people did. Use that as a case study. I also think we need to send strong messages about what we don't want people to do. Here's an agency bragging that they bought a bunch of vehicles for a very low price, but they bought fossil fuel vehicles. I don't want that. That savings isn't worth it to me. So the combination of leadership, messaging, signaling, examples, models, learning, that's how we change behavior. And I think, again, we have our work cut out for us, but we can do that. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks so much, Steve. Thank you. Bye.